Claire Martinez sat in her cramped Manhattan office at 11:47 p.m., surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled campaign drafts that had failed to capture the magic she once felt in words. The advertising world had drained something essential from her writing, turning her gift for language into soulless slogans that sold everything except the dreams she'd abandoned when she chose stability over poetry 3 years ago. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, staring at yet another uninspiring brief for laundry detergent, when the notification sound from her laptop made her heart skip in a way that had become both familiar and dangerous. The message wasn't from her demanding boss or another late-night client crisis, but from a literary forum she joined months ago in a desperate attempt to reconnect with her love for genuine storytelling, where writers from around the world shared their work and dreams. She'd been anonymously posting fragments of her old poetry under the username Ocean of Words, never expecting anyone to truly notice her work among the thousands of other voices seeking connection in the digital wilderness. Tonight felt different somehow, as if the universe was conspiring to remind her of who she used to be before deadlines and corporate presentations consumed her soul. The cursor blinked impatiently on her screen, while something deep inside whispered that she was standing at the edge of a transformation she couldn't yet comprehend, but one that would change everything about the way she understood love, art, and the mysterious power of words to bridge impossible distances between two hearts beating in different hemispheres. Her phone buzzed with another work email, but for the first time in months, Claire ignored it completely. The message came from someone called Soleil Depares, who had read her latest poetry fragment about drowning and corporate expectations while yearning for authentic expression, and his response made Claire's breath catch in her throat. Because he didn't just compliment her writing, he understood the deeper ache behind every carefully chosen word. His message was written in elegant English with subtle French phrases woven naturally throughout, creating a voice that felt both foreign and intimately familiar, as if he'd been reading her thoughts from across an ocean of shared artistic longing. Your words about drowning in expectations while thirsting for truth resonated in ways I haven't felt since my university days in Marseille, he wrote. And Claire found herself reading his message 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of insight about her own work that she hadn't consciously intended, but somehow knew were absolutely accurate. He mentioned how her metaphor of swimming against tides of mediocrity reminded him of Apollinaire's concept of poets as navigators of impossible waters. And the literary reference sent an unexpected thrill through her, because no one in her advertising world had ever connected her writing to actual poetry, let alone French symbolist masters. What made her heart race wasn't just his intellectual depth, but the way he seemed to see through her anonymous username straight to the writer she'd been before deadlines and client demands had calcified her creativity into selling points and taglines. He asked questions about her writing process that no one had asked in years, wanting to know where her images came from and how she chose her rhythms, treating her fragments like real literature worthy of serious discussion rather than late-night therapy sessions disguised as art. When she clicked on his profile and saw he was a published author from Lyon who specialized in literary fiction about connection across impossible distances, Claire felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that seemed to echo from some deeper place than mere attraction, though she couldn't quite name what it was that felt so strangely inevitable about this midnight encounter with a stranger whose words felt like conversations with her own soul. She stared at the reply box for 20 minutes before typing her response, knowing somehow that these next words would change everything. Their correspondence evolved into something Claire had never experienced before, a daily exchange of souls that began with literary discussions but soon revealed the raw honesty that both had been starving for in their respective worlds of commercial expectations and publishing pressures. Every morning she found herself reaching for her phone before coffee, anticipating Julian's messages with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. Because somewhere between his observations about her metaphors and his stories about riding through Parisian winters, she'd begun falling for a mind she'd never seen, but felt she'd known forever. Can you feel Claire's world starting to shift? Something beautiful is building between these two souls, but you have no idea what's really happening behind these perfect messages. Follow Sparks Fly Stories for more incredible love stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about destiny. Now, shall we continue our story? He wrote to her about the loneliness of creating art in isolation, how he'd spend entire days crafting sentences that would touch readers he'd never meet. And Claire found herself sharing secrets she'd never told anyone, confessing how she'd cry in advertising bathrooms after turning beloved poems into slogans for breakfast cereals. Both of them discovering that creativity could be the most isolating gift when surrounded by people who didn't understand its sacred nature. Their messages became longer, more personal, filled with childhood memories of discovering books that changed everything, dreams they'd abandoned for practical choices, and the specific way heartbreak felt different when you experienced it through a writer's consciousness that turned every emotion into careful words. What struck Claire most profoundly was how Julian seemed to understand not just her writing, but the person behind it, commenting on subtle emotional undertones in her poetry that she hadn't consciously intended, but recognized as absolutely true the moment he pointed them out, as if he possessed some intuitive map to her creative process that felt both magical and somehow impossible for someone she'd never met in person. He mentioned small details about her daily life that she'd never explicitly shared, understanding that she wrote late at night because inspiration felt safer in darkness, that she preferred rain because it matched her introspective moods, insights that made her wonder if creative souls truly could recognize each other across any distance, or if there was something else about their connection that felt almost too perfect to be completely random. The first shadow of doubt crept in when she realized she was reshaping her entire life around their correspondence. Checking message timestamps obsessively and feeling genuine anxiety when he took longer than usual to respond, which made her wonder if she was falling in love with a person or the beautiful words he wrote, and whether she could trust feelings this intense for someone whose face she'd never seen, whose voice she'd never heard, whose existence she could only verify through the poetry of his language and the consistency of his digital presence. The first crack in their perfect correspondence appeared when Julian suggested they meet in person during his upcoming book tour in New York, and Claire felt her carefully constructed emotional sanctuary begin to crumble under the weight of reality, because the thought of translating their ethereal connection into flesh and blood encounters terrified her more than she'd ever admitted to herself. Her boss had been demanding increasingly impossible deadlines, forcing her to choose between responding to Julian's thoughtful messages and keeping her job. And each time she delayed replying, she felt something precious slipping away, as if their digital romance existed in a fragile bubble that real-world pressures could shatter with a single touch. What disturbed Claire most was how perfectly Julian seemed to anticipate her moods and responses, as if he could read not just her published words, but her unspoken thoughts, making observations about her daily life in Manhattan that felt impossibly specific for someone who'd never set foot in her neighborhood, never seen her morning coffee ritual, never witnessed the way she arranged her writing space when inspiration struck in the deepest hours of night. When she mentioned feeling overwhelmed by a client presentation, he'd respond with detailed advice about dealing with corporate stress that seemed too precise, too knowing, as if he understood not just writing, but the specific soul-crushing machinery of American advertising culture that she'd never fully explained. The moment that shattered her peace came when Julian referenced a small cafe near her apartment that served the perfect writing atmosphere with tables by windows that catch afternoon light just right, a detail she was certain she'd never shared, making her wonder if their connection was built on something more substantial than coincidence, or if she was falling in love with someone who knew far more about her life than any stranger should, which made every beautiful word he'd written feel suddenly dangerous. Claire stared at his latest message, asking for her phone number so they could finally hear each other's voices, knowing that her answer would either deepen their impossible love or reveal truths that might destroy everything she'd come to treasure about their written romance. The discovery came when Claire's laptop crashed during a crucial client presentation, forcing her to use the office computer, where her desperate search for backup files accidentally revealed her internet history to the entire marketing team, including searches for Julian Moreau-Leon author, Soleil de Paris real identity, and dozens of reverse image searches that made her colleagues exchange uncomfortable glances while she stood frozen in front of the projection screen, realizing that her paranoia about his impossible knowledge had driven her to behaviors that seemed obsessively focused on someone she'd never met in person. What shattered her completely wasn't the professional humiliation, but what she found when she finally returned to her apartment that night and opened every message Julian had ever sent, reading them with new eyes that spotted patterns she'd been too infatuated to notice before. Like how his responses always came exactly when she needed them most. How his literary references perfectly matched her graduate school reading list. How his insights into her creative process seemed less like intuition and more like research, making her wonder if she'd been falling in love with someone who knew far more about her digital footprint than any genuine connection could explain. Wait, did you catch that? Claire's perfect romance just took a turn that will leave you speechless. If you're feeling the same chills she is right now, hit that like button to show sparks fly stories you're completely hooked on this emotional roller coaster. Trust me, You need to see what happens next. Shall we continue our story? The breaking point arrived when she discovered that Julian's latest published novel, which he'd never mentioned in their correspondence, featured a struggling American copywriter named Clara, who wrote poetry under a pseudonym, lived in a studio apartment overlooking a cafe, and dreamed of finding authentic love through words rather than physical encounters. A protagonist so eerily similar to her own life that Claire felt her entire romantic reality crumble into the possibility that she'd been unknowingly living inside someone else's fictional experiment. Or worse, that her most intimate confessions had been material for a writer who drew inspiration from others' emotional experiences. She typed and deleted 17 different messages to him, each one demanding explanations she wasn't sure she wanted to hear, because the alternative to confronting him was preserving the beautiful illusion that someone had truly understood her soul, even if that understanding had been built on research rather than recognition, manipulation rather than magic, until she finally realized that she was more terrified of discovering he was exactly who he claimed to be than she was of proving he was a fraud, because that would mean she'd destroyed the most transcendent connection of her life with her own inability to trust in the impossible possibility of genuine love finding her across an ocean of words. When her phone buzzed with another message from Soleil de Paris, Claire stared at the notification for 7 minutes before deleting it unread, knowing that her next choice would either restore her faith in destined love or teach her that even the most beautiful lies could feel like truth when you needed to believe in magic badly enough. The revelation came at 2:43 a.m. when Claire couldn't sleep and found herself scrolling through old emails, discovering a message from 3 years ago that her advertising agency had sent to all employees about a new French client consultation, mentioning a young novelist named Julien Moreau, who was researching American corporate culture for his latest book about modern love and digital connections. And suddenly, every impossible detail he'd known about her life made perfect sense, because he'd been noticing her, understanding her, recognizing her creative struggles during those consultation meetings she'd forgotten attending. Her hands shook as she realized that their chance meeting on the literary forum hadn't been chance at all, but rather Julian's careful orchestration after months of observing her from across conference rooms, listening to her presentations about consumer psychology, watching her struggle with the creative compromises that advertising demanded, until he'd fallen in love not with her words, but with the woman behind them, the poet trapped in corporate meetings who wrote fragments of her soul into slogans for breakfast cereals. What should have felt like betrayal instead felt like the most romantic gesture anyone had ever made for her. Because while she'd been falling in love with his understanding of her art, he'd been falling in love with her authentic self, the version of her that existed between the lines of her presentations, the woman who arranged her workspace just so, who preferred writing in cafes with afternoon light, who carried poetry in her heart even when her job demanded she write about laundry detergent. Claire picked up her phone and began typing the message she'd been too afraid to send, understanding finally that their connection had been deeper than digital serendipity, more intentional than fate, because sometimes love doesn't wait for perfect timing or ideal circumstances. Sometimes it studies from a distance until it knows exactly how to reach across impossible spaces and offer the kind of understanding that feels like coming home. 7 months later, Claire found herself writing again, with a passion she thought she'd lost forever. But this time, her words carried the weight of a love story that had taught her the difference between coincidence and destiny. Because when Julian finally arrived in New York and they met face to face in that cafe he'd mentioned knowing so well, she realized that falling in love with someone's mind before meeting their heart had created a foundation stronger than anything she'd ever imagined possible. The morning light streaming through their shared apartment window reminded her daily of how Julian had seen her authentic self during those boring corporate meetings, watching her struggle with creative compromises while never knowing that across the conference table sat someone who would eventually offer her not just love, but the permission to return to her truest, artistic self, making her understand that some people enter our lives as researchers, but stay as soulmates, turning what could have been manipulation into the most romantic pursuit she'd ever experienced. She touched the first letter he'd ever written her, now framed beside her computer, remembering how his words had reached across an ocean of misunderstanding to find her exactly when her heart needed proof that authentic connection still existed in a world of shallow interactions. And she smiled, knowing that their epistolary romance had been real from the very first message, because love doesn't require perfect beginnings to create perfect endings. Only two hearts, brave enough to write their truth across any distance. Claire understood now that the universe sometimes uses the most unexpected methods to unite souls who belong together, and that the most beautiful love stories begin not with chance encounters, but with someone caring enough to study the art of reaching your heart, proving that when love is meant to be, it will find a way to write itself into existence, one carefully chosen word at a time. And that's how Claire discovered that the most romantic gesture isn't always a surprise. Sometimes it's someone caring enough to truly study the art of reaching your heart. If this story made you believe that real connections can happen in the most unexpected ways, subscribe to Sparks Fly Stories and hit that like button. We share these incredible true love stories because sometimes we all need proof that soulmates really do find each other, no matter how impossible the odds seem. What's the most thoughtful thing someone has done to understand you better? Let us know in the comments below.